Gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Grechen, Jann. I'm not sure what she hasn't done. From turning around Mooney as CEO to leading the Air Race Classic to running a software company, she has done all kinds of wonderful things, great passion for aviation, and she is known for her expertise in building great boards, both for-profit companies and non-profit companies. And she's going to share some of that wisdom with us here this afternoon. Thank you, Grechen.
Thank you, Ethan. As you heard, I've done a whole variety of different things. Anywhere from, I had my own software startup company and raised venture capital for it and built a board with that. I also was CEO at Mooney as a restart. I also ran an aircraft manufacturing company down in New Zealand. I was part of a management team of an aircraft manufacturing company in Germany. And when I decided I had enough of the corporate environment and running companies and building boards in that environment, I decided to have my own company focused on building boards with small companies and oftentimes being an outside board director. Many people say, oh, boards, they're boring. However, besides the fact that most of your bylaws say that you have to have one, they can be either one of the very best assets you have in building your company, or they can be sort of this non-entity, or they can be a real drag. And one of the things that really, I think, makes a difference for a company is to have a well-performing board, have a great board that, in fact, propels the company forward. So a question to all of you, have you been on a great board? Have you ever had that experience, and what made them great? Yes?
I was on a board in Jacksonville, Florida, for an organization that did child. It was a child caring organization, and they had started during the Civil War, and they evolved into taking care of throwaway kids, basically. And what made that board so successful was that it was movers and shakers in the community that had a strategic vision. They didn't get into the tactical component of the operation, and they all brought cash to the game. Everybody was financially invested and brought other investors. So they were mentally thinking of the future. They were taking care of today's problems with cash, and they were supportive of what the president and CEO did. They always backed him.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll echo what you're saying. I was on a board at Duke University and then at the Colorado League of Charter Schools board. And governance, good governance, a lot of nonprofit boards just don't understand good governance and what their role really is. It's not to get in there and run the organization. The best boards bring cash or bring other people's cash, and they provide governance but not micromanagement. And they have active, engaged subcommittees that are regularly meeting. So.
Okay, so some of you had experience with great boards. Okay, I'm sure some of you have had experience with not so great boards. Anybody out there? Me? Yeah, not so great boards. Okay. So what I'd like to take a look at here this afternoon is some of the general characteristics of boards, to make sure that we're all on the level set about boards. Take a little bit of a look at dysfunctions and some ideas on how to make your board great. Okay. So first of all, some first principles about a board. And here, I'm going to be talking mostly about nonprofit boards. There's overall responsibility for the conduct of the organization, what it is that the organization does, also what the organization doesn't do. Okay. What are your strategies, direction and guidance, but also to make sure that the organization is functioning financially well. Okay. And there's accountability, both in terms of the finances and how the programs are working. Okay, are you in fact achieving the aims of your overall organizational purpose? And to build the leadership team, and to make sure you have a good set of people who are leading the organization. They're a group. They are not acting as individuals. They need to act together as a group. I've had some boards that haven't done that, where in fact individuals have gone out on their own, and it has been, well, let's put it this way, the results have not been so good. Okay. It's very important that the board work together, make decisions as a group, enact as a group, except sometimes you will in fact delegate certain things to board members or to board committees. Okay. There are also three major duties of a board. Okay. There is the duty of obedience. This means that everything that is done is in accordance with the charitable purpose of the organization. Duty of care, that people show up, look at information, and are as diligent as possible in making decisions. That doesn't mean that decisions are always correct, but that you in fact take the time to think through things, ask questions, and make the very best possible decision you can within the circumstances, information available to you. And the duty of loyalty. In other words, that there isn't self-dealing. Okay. How many of you have a conflict of interest policy? Yes. If you haven't, I strongly recommend that you create one and that everyone in the organization reads it and signs it. Okay. This is all about making sure that you avoid conflicts of interest, or if there is a potential conflict, that's recognized and it's talked about. Yes, it may be that, for instance, you need someone to do, let's say you have a building and you need someone to do some lawn care. And it makes sense to have the son of one of the board members actually do that work. Well, that could be viewed as a conflict of interest, but if the board talks about it, is paid market rate, that in fact there's oversight, in fact does the work, that could be fine. But the point is that you've all talked about it, looked at it, and agreed that it's not self-dealing, okay? That it is, in fact, something that is in the best interest of the organization. Okay. If you've been on both a corporate board and a nonprofit board, sometimes people have a tough time making that transition. They are very similar, but there are some things that are in fact very different about nonprofit versus for-profit corporations. For instance, in a corporation, you are focused on how to win in the market, whereas the nonprofit is about what are we doing relative to the cause that we represent? How are we advancing that? Our major success comes from the programs, the impact that we've had positively on our constituents, whereas a for-profit corporation, your success is how profitable are you, your market cap, your return on investment to your shareholders. Okay, in corporation, the board sets the strategy, and the CEO, oftentimes has significant latitude on how to execute that strategy. Nonprofits keep a much tighter rein on, in general, on the strategy and controlling how the senior executive, whether it's an executive director or CEO, actually executes against that. Okay, now this is in general. Oftentimes, very large nonprofits, there will be more latitude for the senior executive, but in very small ones, okay, which I believe most of us here are small, okay, there is a much tighter control, there's much greater oversight on what happens. Corporations oftentimes have smaller boards unless you get to be a multi-billion-dollar corporation, in which case they may have larger boards. Business professionals, and they receive compensation oftentimes for being on the board, whereas with our nonprofits, oftentimes we have larger boards to bring in other kinds of expertise. They're volunteers. Oftentimes they have little business background, okay, which can be both good and bad. Generally, there's a greater amount of diversity, but they are unpaid volunteers. Okay? And lastly, the nonprofit, your operational structure, a lot of it depends on your size. In many cases, for instance, I was on the board of the Air Ice Classic for many years. We had a 12-member board, and it was a working board. Okay, not only was it strategy, but also tactics, and each individual was in charge of executing some element of the race. Okay, that's a very common thing in a nonprofit board. Okay, whereas generally in a corporation, the management and staff are the ones who execute, who actually do the work, as opposed to the board. Now, in recruiting board members, there's a lot of literature about how does it recruit them. Oftentimes from family, friends, people that you know, or you say, well, gee, I really need people with a bunch of other kinds of business background from a wide variety of things. What makes sense for my nonprofit to really have other insights that I can benefit from? Or is it useful for me to have someone with a particular kind of reputation in the industry that will elevate how people perceive the organization and will attract investment? Or varieties of connections, networks, to be able to bring that to the nonprofit. Or diversity, ranges of ages, ethnicity, gender, social background. How is that going to benefit my board? And really bring other kinds of insights, or the money, as you heard from this gentleman back here. One of the nonprofits he was on, everyone not only was a major donor, but was also responsible for bringing in donations. And you find that in some of the larger nonprofits. For instance, the United Way is that way, or the Red Cross. Okay, smaller nonprofits that may not be the case. Okay. Sometimes when you are transitioning from being small to being large, the board may decide that it's important to have that kind of view and philosophy and makeup on the board. And in fact, I grew up in a nonprofit environment. My father was the executive director of the local YMCA. And his board, which cycled through every year, their primary responsibility was fundraising. They were both the major donors and they were responsible for bringing in significant amount of funds. That was their job. And the other things that you normally have a board do, those were secondary to the fundraising piece. So it may be as you grow your nonprofit that that's a direction that you feel will be of benefit. You may have a different philosophy, but a lot of it is the board talking to each other about what the makeup of the board should be, what is optimal in your situation. And what I find too many times with boards is that, well, either they just sort of, take the warm body that says, oh yeah, I'll be on the board, okay? Or it's only people that they know, or they're very worried about bringing in any kind of, outside folks because that may rock the boat. And that's not necessarily optimal. Yes, Doug.
I just want to reinforce recruiting great board members is absolutely critical to your organization. And I'll share from personal experience, in our community, we have a great financial organization that'll go unnamed, who has been a marketing powerhouse in our community for 50 years. And they, unfortunately, use your nonprofit as a stepping stone for promotion for their talent. And so their staff is ubiquitous throughout the nonprofit community on boards, and they have no formal training, and they are not aligned with your mission, and they are absolutely ineffective. And so they take a spot, and everybody allows them on because they think it's going to bring the marketing arm of the financial institution behind it, and it doesn't appear. And so that's a caveat, recruiting good board members, and tomorrow you're going to hear about top grading, identifying those great candidates both for your staff, but also for your boards.
Thank you, Doug. Now, these are all areas to look at with background, experience, skills, very important considerations to bring to your board. But there's another area that I want to talk about that oftentimes is overlooked, okay? And that is the softer skills, the other kinds of things that are important for you to look at for your board. One is, first of all, do they have heartfelt support for the cause? And here I mean something different from being passionate about it. yes, they deeply care about it, but they also bring both heart and brains to think about what is the best way to move your nonprofit forward. Being passionate, I think, is not enough. Okay, then mix of strategic and tactical points of view. There's room for both folks on your board, providing advice and guidance as opposed to just telling you how things are, and a diversity of thought process. Okay, having people who can both leap, across, considerations to a particular insight, very important, but also people who are methodical, okay, and will look at every angle and ask questions and consider alternatives. It's all very important. Personality and chemistry, if your board doesn't get along, okay, if the chemistry isn't right, okay, you got to figure out how to make that chemistry right. One of my major criteria is the ability to ask good questions. Okay. In fact, I believe that that's the major value I bring to the boards that I'm on, is to ask people to think, because oftentimes asking a question, thinking about things more deeply, gets you to a better solution than the very first one or two that come up and are proposed. Okay. So cultivate the ability to ask questions. Coupled with that is ability to listen well. Now, I believe you can't ask good questions if you're not actively listening, and listening not just for the words that are said, okay, but also the body language that is expressed and the underlying, concerns that may prompt, the questions or output or conversation that is happening. And then able to disagree effectively. Okay. Have you ever had the experience of being in a board meeting and the board members are yelling at each other? Okay. Did that ever produce a good outcome? No. Okay. But have you also been in a meeting where someone suggests something and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." Okay. And you go through a whole board meeting and it's all, yeah, okay, good, yeah. Is that a good outcome either? No, neither alternative is any good. Okay, neither of them. Okay, and figuring out how to disagree effectively, how to challenge while keeping the energy level low. Okay, such that people can, in fact, listen to the challenge and think about the challenge and then respond appropriately. Either, oh, gee, I never thought of that, but maybe we can do this about it, okay? As opposed to, the startled reaction. Okay, so all of these kinds of softer skills to look for in your board members, and to have your board members talk about. Say, how are we doing with this particular soft skill? Do we have it? Do we not? Should we recruit for it? Okay. Or do we have too much of it? Do we need the opposite to really have a good mix? Okay. So some challenges for a board. First of all, it's not like a team. You come together as a team, but you don't have a lot of the same kind of say business team setup where essentially you have some sort of decision maker. Because in essence, a board is a collection of peers. There is no one individual who is the decision maker. Okay. There are some boards where there is the belief that the chairman of the board is the decision maker. And I challenge you to look at your bylaws and find out where it says that. Okay. The chairman of the board is responsible for, the agenda, for making sure that there is a meeting. They may or may not be the individual who's leading the meeting, but they make sure that somebody does. And if you have a really good leader as your chairman of the board, they will do their best to get the best out of everybody in the board and make sure that people, in fact, participate and contribute. Okay. But you are, a group of peers, and you get your work done through persuasion. Okay? And through, again, listening and then speaking effectively with each other, airing points of view to persuade people to make a particular kind of decision that's in the best interest of the organization. Okay. Now, sometimes there are boards where people hesitate to speak up. Okay, and they hesitate to speak up because they don't want to be thought of as foolish, or the questions that they might ask or points they might raise might cause them to lose respect. Okay, so a good board will in fact make it a good environment, a safe environment for people to speak up. Okay. Also remember that your board members, they are part-time amateurs. Okay. They come together for the board meeting. They may have work to do in between board meetings. We hope that there is. But those who are running the organization are full-time professionals at running the organization. Your CEO, your executive director, your head manager, whoever it is that is actually doing the day-to-day work. Okay? They are full-time professionals at that. And so it's not the board's job to actually do the job of your CEO and your executive director. Okay, and they need to remember that. So, if your board is dysfunctional, what are some of the symptoms of a failing board? And I'm going to start to make a list here. If anyone wants to tell me how you can tell if your board is in fact failing. Okay. Okay, so this could be not showing up regularly for meetings, or they are physically there and mentally and emotionally somewhere else. Okay, so they're not really showing up. Yeah. Okay, so failure to contribute financially, both giving and getting. And apologies in advance for my handwriting. What else, sir? Okay, so failing when the board tries to run the organization. In other words, they're not permitting the CEO to do so. Okay, so the question is, does it apply to the board in general or to individuals on the board? And I would say yes. Okay, so if in fact you have an individual on the board who is also attempting to micromanage your CEO, that's also another way to see that your board is failing. Other thing.
The board is donating time and talent in addition to treasure. They're coming down and helping out.
Okay, so the board is contributing time and talent. Now, I might challenge that a little bit, because if you're a very small nonprofit, you depend on volunteers, and your board may, both be a board of volunteers, but they may also be volunteers in the organization. And so, if you are a very large organization, yes, the board contributing time and talent in lieu of the CEO or the executive director doing that, then yes, absolutely, that's a dysfunction. Right. Doug?
I have a situation. It's a good and bad situation. In our evolution, we've got some gaps. I've got some very, very talented people on our board. A couple of the board members have stepped in to help fill gaps as we evolve. In one case, it's extraordinarily helpful. It's in the IT realm, and I don't have somebody like that right now to help develop and install our IT strategy and equipment. On the other, so I appreciate that. We got a good working relationship. He's come up and asked me flat out, when I came on board a month ago, he says, do you want me to continue doing this or not? And I looked at him, I said, I like what we're doing, let's press. The other, not so helpful. And it has to do with our education effort. And in that one, down in the weeds, lots of talk and bluster, not a lot of real help in all of this. And so I find myself in the situation with that one of trying to figure out how to control this particular board member, and that's not the right word. Yes, it is. About how to have this person remove themselves from the role they're playing and go back to just to being an overarching board member and providing advice, not doing what they're doing. So it's interesting because this can work both ways depending on your need, and I'm experiencing both of them.
Yeah, good point. And we'll talk afterwards. I have some suggestions for you. Okay. Yes.
I think the board is failing if they're focused on the day-to-day operations.
Yeah, and I would say this is focused primarily on operations rather than on strategy. Any more? Yes. Okay, so not consistently and reasonably evaluating the executive director. Okay, last one.
Board that is not fresh or it's not always perhaps atrophy, board members aren't blowing off or on.
So how's about if I say the board is stagnant? And it's stagnant, and I'm not going to spell this right, in its membership. Okay. And it's a question of, can you have too many? The answer is yes. Okay. But that's a different discussion. You can also have too few. Okay. So here's some additional things that I have about symptoms of board dysfunction. Okay. You don't have very good dialogue. There are conflicting agendas that nobody talks about. Okay. That they focus on insignificant issues. They go off on tangents. They don't really come to grips with the major issues facing the organization. The CEO, executive director, is always on the defensive. Okay, so there's a significant either lack of support that may not be verbalized and addressed. No consensus, no order. People have secret meetings, and you show up at a board meeting, and someone says, "Oh, well, we already decided this." It's like, "Oh, really? No board discussion? Oh, no, we already decided." Okay, those kinds of things. And there's a lack of trust. So all of these things will, in fact, contribute to a very dysfunctional board. So how do we go about addressing the dysfunction? First of all, it really helps if your board members know each other and know each other on a personal level. Okay, if there's any way you can hold a retreat or have social time before and after the board meeting so people can get to know each other. You work better with someone that you see as a person rather than, oh, that's the teacher, that's the lawyer, okay? And to make sure that people develop those personal relationships. Also in your board meeting, I don't know if you've heard of the concept of holding the space. Okay, this is something that you want to have not just your chairman of the board responsible for, but all board members, to make sure that you have an atmosphere within that meeting where it is a safe place for people to speak up and to be themselves. And that you hold that to encourage the feeling of safety and mutual respect so that people will speak up and will come to grips with the hard things. Okay? And it'll be okay. Okay? This is also holding the space, is to also tone down any negative energy to be the kind of energy that really produces good work together. And you can set an example by actively listening, in fact, feeding back to people what it is that you hear, be open, collaborate, and empower people to share and to ask questions of each other. Okay? Have an agenda, stick to it. Some of this is just basic meeting management kinds of things. But I've also found that something that really helps is what I call the meeting before the meeting, and the meeting after the meeting. Okay? And the meeting before the meeting is where people talk about what it is that you're going to talk about at the meeting, so that people are all informed. Okay? They have the information, they can be prepared. This is not the same as having secret meetings. Okay? This is to make sure that when people get together in the board meeting, it's very good, productive conversation. And you can't have productive conversation if people aren't aware of what it is that's going to be talked about. Okay, so the meeting before the meeting, and oftentimes that's the responsibility of the chairman of the board, is to do that. It's also a way of hearing people's concerns so that you can start to think of, well, how to address those. And it's to socialize ideas, propose solutions, and what have you, so that when you have the meeting, it's really good substantive conversation. Okay, and then the meeting after the meeting is where people talk about what happened in the meeting and how they're going to follow up on it, or if they had any subsequent ideas, things that hadn't come up, that's, oh, I thought about this, oh, I thought about that. So that there is a mechanism, okay, for those things to be heard and something done about them. Okay. I had one organization where there was one individual on the board where, and we would have, a lot of telephonic meetings because some of the board members were in Europe and some were in Asia, and okay, so it was very complicated. Somebody was up in the middle of the night whenever we had a telephonic board meeting, but I had one individual who, after the board call and put down the phone, and I'd sit there and I'd say, okay, 3 minutes from now he's going to call me. Okay, so I'd do a little thing, okay, and then he'd call me. He said, I thought about, okay. So is one of those individuals where it took him a while to process things, okay, before then he would think more. And so we all got accustomed to this and say, well, okay, even though we had the board meeting and we decided on something else is going to come up, and we're just going to have to get used to the fact that we're going to think about that, and we're going to address it. We couldn't get him to think and process any faster, and yet he had wonderfully valuable ideas. So we all went with the flow, and that's part of getting to know each other personally. Okay. Make sure people speak up. What I would do on telephonic calls is I would call on people to, in fact, speak about something, and I never did it in the same order, so nobody knew when they were going to be called on. But they knew that they were going to be called on, and to say, well, what do you think about this? What's your reaction to that? What are your feelings? What have you? And it was a way, actually, I had one board where there was one woman who had zero board experience, not a whole lot of executive experience, but she was very intuitive. And it took a while, and it took a lot of this calling on her before she began to speak up. And she had some of the best ideas, okay? But she had to be encouraged to do so, okay? And then we made a tiger out of her, okay? And also, as I said, address the elephant in the room. Anything that is, in fact, an unspoken problem, unspoken conflict, unspoken truism that's affecting your conversations. You are better off surfacing it, talking about it, addressing it, because otherwise it's going to sit there and in fact, have a negative impact on your conversations, what you decide. Okay, so there's some additional steps to making your board great. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay, pretty good. These are some of my favorites. Okay, the board needs to understand roles and responsibilities. They're leading, they're not managing. Okay, engaging with others inside and outside of the board, talking and listening. Providing strategic rather than operational support. Getting to that one point over there of too much focus on operations. Regular turnover. In fact, I was on a nonprofit board not all that long ago where I decided to term limit myself. I'd been on the board for 14 years. We had effected significant change within that period of time. But I felt it was time for new ideas, new folks. We had some fabulous people, in the wings, ready to step up. So not only did I term limit myself, but it encouraged the remaining board to put into the bylaws a maximum number of terms that someone could be on the board. Yeah.
Rid yourself. Just as an additional note on that, it's not like the board member is going to be gone completely from the organization. There is a possibility of making them board member emeritus to kind of keep them involved. But it's just something. It's a nice way to keep them involved, but mix things up.
Yeah, mixing things up. In this particular organization, I've still remained very, very active in a couple of committees. Places where I felt that I could continue to effect change. And I'm an advisor to the board. And in fact, I was coach to the CEO for the first year of her tenure before we agreed that she was, fledged and ready to leave the nest. And she's done a fabulous job since then. But yeah, board members who are stepping off can continue to be extremely valuable to the organization. And in fact, they have a lot of the wisdom and the past history and things that you can benefit from. And so keeping them somehow engaged can be very important. Getting the right information at the board meetings, being prepared for a board meeting, as opposed to having a discussion and then everyone says, well, I need to get more information about that. Or, I don't have the data. It's like, come on, guys. This is the place for us to have that all in front of us so that we can really, in fact, talk about it and make a good decision. So being prepared, working as a team, talked about challenging appropriately, and reviewing one's own performance. Are we doing well as a board? So my question to all of you is, what else do you see about making a board great? And how can you continue to make the boards that you're on great? Yes.
I would certainly say we've talked about a little bit the varied experience and going as wide as you can possibly stand it. I know from our example, we have several people that represent like veterans like myself that are transitioning. We have people that are in the airline industry or commercial aviation, but we have several people who are not in aviation at all. And some of them help us in particular money aspects, but other portions, they represent our target audience who are not yet aviators, and they'll bring points of view to our meetings that you're not capable of turning your brain back to a point that accurately reflects like the insights we talked about at the first meeting.
Yeah, that was one of the things that was not on that one slide is representatives on your board of your constituency, your target community. And I guess that may be a challenge to some of us who are in the aviation education space, because our target audience are young people. And is your board, perhaps would it be useful to have someone from that demographic as a board member? Okay, and what's the pluses and minuses, the great things and challenges from that? Other things about making your board great.
suggestion that's been given is just maybe a review of financial statements, because nonprofit and for-profit financial statements sometimes look different. And sometimes you have members on your board that are captains of their industry, but they might be afraid to ask a question on how a not-for-profit financial statement works. So to save anyone embarrassment, just a refresher course. Here's what we're looking for, here's how to read these, and then maybe they'll be more apt to ask questions in the future.
Yeah, a lot of captains of industry are not at all familiar with funds accounting, okay, which can be a mainstay of a nonprofit organization where you have different funds. But it's also, I found, if you're very, very small, you may have volunteers who are doing your books, and they don't understand funds accounting either. Okay, so getting them to, in fact, prepare useful information on which you can then, in fact, make useful decisions. So, one last comment.
As the CEO, I've invited the board members and their spouses or partners or whatever to do fun things together too. We've gone skiing, boating, and where I am now, we've gone to Oshkosh with board members. We just did a trip to Orville and Wilbur's house and the Air Force Museum in Dayton, took board members, so engage them in what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, thank you very much. Okay, I'm sure there'll be more conversation about this.
Thank you, Gretchen, so much. Appreciate it.